Okay, welcome to Chapter 2, Economics. When you think about economics, what do you think of? A lot of people just think, well, do people have jobs? Well, that's absolutely part of it. Sometimes you'll hear measurements on the news of economic performance and not know what some of those measurements mean. When they talk about the inflation rate, or the gross domestic product. What do those things mean? Those are some of the items we're going to touch on in this chapter. One of the things I want you to realize, though, is that the study of economics will really help you make better decisions as a business person. For example, if you've got a bunch of experts saying that they're predicting the economy to take a downturn in the next few months, and they all agree the economy is really tightening up. Well, if you're a business owner, for example, you probably would not want to take on any additional debt right now. You probably would not want to hire a bunch of new employees right now, because chances are, if the economy is headed downward, your sales may also be headed downward or taking a hit. But the opposite, of course, would be true too. If economic experts were saying, hey, we think the economy is doing great and is going to continue to do so for quite a while, well, it might be a good time to go ahead and take out that loan to expand your business, or hire that extra employee, or buy that extra delivery truck, whatever the case may be. So those are the kinds of things that economics will tell you, help you make better decisions. So in this chapter, there we go. We'll talk about the definition of economics and a couple of ways that we look at economics. We'll also look at the global economic crisis. The reason we're doing that is because it's a good kind of encapsulation of the whole economic process and some of the things that the government does to affect the economy. We'll also talk about fiscal and monetary policy. We'll talk about the free market system, which is primarily what the United States system is. We'll also talk about socialistic and communist systems, and then kind of the mix of item 3 and 4. All right, and then we'll finish up with some tools to evaluate economic performance. All right, so the study of economics. First of all, the economy, you could think of as a financial and social system. In other words, how do resources flow throughout our economy? Remember in chapter 1, we talked about the 4 economic inputs. Those are some of the inputs we're talking about. Money, of course, is another input that we're talking about, a resource that is flowing through our economy. So economics is a study of that. And as part of that, it's also a study of what kind of choices that people, companies, or governments make that kind of makes the allocation of those resources, makes sense of those allocations. So a couple of different ways to look at economics. Macro, of course, meaning big, large. That's when you're looking at an overall country's economic dynamics. So that's when we're going to use a lot of the statistics and measurements that you find towards the end of this chapter. And then microeconomics, that's when you're looking at what an individual or individual family or individual company may be doing. Like, why do they make the choices that they make? All right, let's just very briefly touch on the global economic crisis. In the mid-90s, the internet was still a brand new thing. E-commerce was an even newer thing. And if you recall from chapter 1, when we talked about speed to market, one of the 2 items under that was bleeding edge, meaning a concept or a product or service that is maybe being released a little bit too soon. kind of e-commerce was kind of in that category in the mid to late 90s. It was, the idea of buying online was still brand new. I mean, of course, all the experts were saying that it was going to be the wave of the future, the next big thing. So, unfortunately for investors, a lot of them, when they saw any company that had a .com, had a website, which is a pretty rare thing at the time, a special thing, they got overexcited and they would make decisions based on not so great information. In other words, they were buying stock in all these companies that had websites, these .coms as they were called, even though they weren't profitable. And they just kept pouring money, buying more and more and more stock in these companies, thinking that they were going to start making money. But unfortunately for them, at the time, e-commerce was kind of bleeding edge. It was a great idea, and yes, it did eventually turn out to be a thing. But at the time, for most consumers, it was just too early. They just didn't understand it. They didn't trust it. So they weren't using it. So these companies, these .coms, they were losing money hand over fist. So by 2000, the bubble burst and those companies lost money. And so that really pulled the economy down. Then right out in 2001, of course, we had the terrorist attacks, destroyed a lot of our financial sector in New York City, hurt our travel industry. I mean, our economy really took a nosedive as a result of that. Unemployment went way up, as a matter of fact. Then enter the subprime mortgage loans. That was a mess. So what was happening is, at the time, in fact, the video on the next page doesn't really mention this, but the government was putting a lot of pressure on banks at this time to make loans to poor people. Some people were saying, buying a home is a right, not a privilege that has to be earned. It's a right. So you banks, you better make loans or we're going to regulate the crud out of you. So that was part of, so government was complicit in this. The banks then said, oh, okay, fine. You want us to make a bunch of loans to poor people? Fine, we'll do so. So they made loans to people knowing they couldn't repay the mortgage without even, in some cases, verifying employment. They would make loans. They would also set up these loans so that maybe people could afford the mortgage payments for a few months, and then they would ramp up the payments to a level they knew the borrowers couldn't afford in a lot of cases. Not all banks were being unethical, but the reason these banks were willing to make these bad loans was because they had no intention of keeping the loans. They were going to sell them to somebody else. So, really unethical stuff by a lot of banks. So banks were culpable also. So the government was culpable, banks were culpable, and then, of course, borrowers were culpable because they were like, hey, you want to give me a loan for a very expensive home I can't afford? Yeah, I'll worry about the payments later. Yeah, give me that loan. I'd love to buy a nice house. So borrowers were culpable also. They were also signing paperwork they didn't really understand. So another thing that happened at this time is investors were looking at these mortgage loans and thinking, you know what? These are a good investment. They're AAA rated. Reporting agencies were still rating these loans as very good investments because, they had houses attached to it. So a lot of big investment companies were buying thousands of these home mortgage loans and packaging them into securities that could be that they could then trade on the open financial market. People could buy shares of these. Seemed like a great idea at the time, but remember, these were not good loans for the most part to begin with. So after not very long, people started defaulting on these loans, and in doing so, these investment companies were trying to get these houses back and sell them, but there was so many people defaulting, there was a glut of houses out on the market. So anytime you have a bunch of something out on the market, the value of it goes down. So now there's a ton of houses out on the open market that aren't worth near as much as people paid for them, not near as much as banks, were on the hook for, because they had the mortgage for so many. So these financial institutions started failing big time. And this brought the entire economy down. It was a giant mess. There was a lot of worry at the time, in fact, that we were going to have a complete collapse of our economy. So the government did step in to try to stave off this economic collapse. I'm not going to play this video. I'll let you play this video that's on this page. There's a video that really explains the financial crisis really, really well. And in fact, it actually discusses, it's about a 15-minute video, I think. It discusses several other topics that are in this chapter. So definitely watch this video. Very good video. As a matter of fact, that website that video is from, Crash Course, is a great website. If you're taking economics and you're at all unclear on any particular concept, go to that website. It'll definitely help you out. Investopedia is another great website, not just for economics, but for any business topic, accounting, finance, you name it. So definitely remember those websites. All right, so towards the end of George Bush's presidency, they passed the TARP bailout. Essentially, it was to kind of keep these ginormous banks and other financial organizations from collapsing, because that could really seriously damage our economy even worse. So, it was very controversial. Obviously, if somebody does something stupid, you kind of want them to suffer the consequences. But unfortunately, had we let them fail and go out of business, as they deserved, it would have hurt a lot of innocent people right along with it. So government stepped in, passed this huge economic recovery bill. By the way, our government does not have a giant pile of money sitting in an account somewhere to pay for stuff like this. We don't. In fact, our government operates at a deficit every month. It's like our government uses a credit card. They can't pay their bills every month. So they buy things on credit by selling government or buying government, or they sell government securities, and they use the proceeds to pay for things like TARP. So towards the end of George Bush's second term, TARP was passed. Most of that money was spent. They also used some of it to bail out the auto industries that were just struggling at the time. Soon thereafter, Barack Obama's administration came in, and they passed another $700 billion recovery program to kind of keep bailing these people out. It was supposed to also infuse the economy with money, because when you have more money flying around inside the economy, it grows the economy. Well, unfortunately, when the government steps in to try to pick winners and losers, it doesn't work very well. Do an internet search. Try to find infrastructure that was actually built with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act money. Good luck. Also try to find a green energy project that was funded by this act, and find one that was successful. Good luck with that. Beware when the government says we're here to help. So we don't really know where a lot of that money went for both programs, but we do know that we did get a lot of that paid back from the auto industry, from a lot of those banks. I say a lot. Some of those banks were able to pay that money back. So in any case, whether you agree with we should have done all of this stuff and, further added to the national debt or not, our economy did recover. All right, so let's look at some of the things that governments do to try to keep the economy humming along. One is fiscal policy. If I were you, in my notes, I would put next to fiscal policy, taxing and spending. So, tax law is introduced from Congress. They write tax bills, then the president signs off on it, and that's how we get our tax law, our tax legislation. That's how we set our tax rates. Congress also decides how all the money that's taken in through taxes and tariffs and fees, how it's spent. So that's fiscal policy, taxing and spending. So how our government manages taxing and spending has a big impact on the economy. The whole idea is you're trying to encourage growth, keep employment at a good level, and curb inflation. Now, a couple of things you have to understand, though, about these concepts. So if you have lower taxes, that stimulates the economy because that leaves more money in the hands of you and me. And when we have more money left after each paycheck, we tend to spend more. When there's more money flying around the economy, when people are spending money, when businesses have more money, they spend money. That builds the economy. Helps grow the economy. But if the economy grows too fast, you get inflation goes along with it. So what we really want to do as far as fiscal policy goes is you want slow, steady economic growth and very slow, predictable inflation. That's what we want. Okay? So it's kind of a balancing act, though. It's not easy to do. And while we know that low taxes is good for the economy, we still have to pay for stuff, right? We still have to pay for roads and national defense and healthcare and Social Security and all that good stuff. But it's a balancing act. So before you get too wrapped around the axle angry at the other political, one political party for irresponsibly, spending and piling on debt, you could also get mad at the other political party for saying, oh, well, you want to cut spending to the point where we are throwing granny out on the street. We're firing police officers and teachers. It goes both ways, and depending on who's in power in Congress and in the White House, they point fingers at each other. My point is, both sides are culpable in growing the national debt. Both sides do agree, though, that there's a balancing act between taxing and spending. It's just a matter of degrees. All right? So don't get too wrapped around the axle about that. In case you don't know, our government operates at a deficit every single month. They spend more money than they know that they are taking in taxes. And they have been doing it every year since 1957. They don't care. It's like if you have an irresponsible friend who spends more money than they make every month, and their debt is growing and growing, and then they get really stupid, and they get credit cards, and then they start trying to pay their bills with credit cards, and the next month, do they start trying to curtail their spending and pay down that debt? No. In fact, they keep spending more, and then every time their credit card maxes out, they just try to get more credit. Well, that's essentially what your United States government does every single year, and they've been doing it for so long. We now have a national debt that is nearly $20 trillion. It's ridiculous, right? Really stupid, but you got to think about how do you deal with it? You can keep raising the debt ceiling. You can absolutely do that, and that's typically what happens, and there's a big fight over it every year. The Republicans say, hey, we need to keep taxes low. to keep growing the economy, and the Democrats said, no, we need to raise taxes so we can have more money to pay our bills. And then the Republicans come back and they say, hey, no, we need to just cut spending. Cut spending. And the Democrats come back and they say, if you cut spending across the board, it's going to cause all kinds of problems. You're going to throw Granny out on the street, etc. It goes back and forth. It's ridiculous. But again, just know that fiscal policy is absolutely a necessary evil. We have to have some level of taxation to pay our bills and provide services, but we also have to be responsible in our spending. So depends who you ask where that balancing act is between taxing and spending. All right, outcomes of a budget. So very similar to the financial equation we learned in the first chapter, total revenue minus total expenses is profit or loss. You can think of the same thing similarly as a budget, right? A budget is a plan for how you're going to spend the amount of money you believe you're going to bring in. So every year, Congress makes a budget. They have an idea that they're going to bring in so much money per year. Now, of course, if their plan is to spend less than they make, well, that's awesome. That's what the great state of Texas does, right? We have a budget surplus here in Texas. We spend our money responsibly. We have money in the bank in case something happens. Then you got a state like California and a whole bunch of other states that operate at a deficit every single month. They spend a lot more money than they take in, and they don't care because they figure, well, by the time the politicians figure by the time we get out of office, everything will still be okay. It's just, like your grandkids who will be stuck putting the bill. Well, federal government, they operate at a deficit, have been doing so for many, 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 many years, to the point where we now have a federal debt that is just astronomical. It's starting to take up more and more and more of our annual budget. As a matter of fact, a couple of slides I wanted to show you just real quick. Just kind of give you an idea where our tax revenue comes from. If you take a look at, hang on one second, let me change this. There we go. If you take a look at where our tax dollars come from, most tax revenue comes from individual income taxes. Actually, right along with that comes employment taxes, right? So from you and me, the overwhelming of majority of tax revenue, that's where it comes from, right? So poor people don't really pay taxes, individual income taxes. Top 2% of the United States pays like 70% of the taxes, so they do pay their fair share, believe me. What else? Notice corporate taxes actually makes up a pretty small amount of total tax revenue. But that's the part of taxes that gets all the press. Because they say, oh, the majority of the tax cuts went to corporations. First of all, corporations are not evil. It's just a business entity type. Second of all, if poor people pay zero taxes and corporations pay taxes and taxes are cut, obviously corporations are going to have a bigger tax relief than poor people if poor people don't pay taxes. Something to think about. All right. Take a look at the deficit, how it's grown over the years. Prior to the 70s, the national debt, like our budget deficits, that is how much we plan to spend more than we're taking in every year, was pretty low. During World War II, now it was the exception, right? During World War II, obviously pretty high deficits because we had to pay for a big war. But take a look at this chart. You can see that no matter who the president was, Republican or Democrat, they both did the same thing, right? We were running at deficits that whole time. Now, during this time here in the late 90s, let's see, we had a Democrat president, but we had a Republican House and Senate. So take your pick who you'd like to give credit for the surpluses in the late 90s. Now take a look at 2008 all the way to 2012, 13 or so, right? As you can see, we really went out of control with the deficit. Some people say that was necessary, but that is a fourfold increase in deficits. So, all right. So before you get too excited and start pointing fingers at only the Democrats, let's take a look at this. Okay, so the national debt, way back prior to World War II, it was extremely low. In fact, almost non-existent for quite a few years in the first part of our country. In the 80s, it really started to grow. So this is Jimmy Carter was president back in here. Some of the worst economy we had in modern times since the Great Depression anyway. Ronald Reagan came in, he spent some money, but did a lot of good things, and it really ramped up the economy, but it also increased the debt. So we had a fairly slow rise in the national debt until early 2000s. Then the economic crisis hit, and then boom, we quadrupled the national debt in 8 years. Quadrupled it. All right, and so before you get too happy, you Republicans pointing the finger at the Democrats, new administration and Republican Congress takes over, the trajectory is only slightly lower. It's still pointed straight up almost. So plenty of blame to go around for irresponsible stupidity when it comes to using credit to finance instead of being responsible and cutting our spending and making putting taxes at a level that makes sense for us to pay down our debt. So why isn't, by the way, corporate income taxes, I just have this in here. So corporate taxes were 38% when this particular slide was made. That was the highest in the entire world. They were recently dropped down to 21%. Had a huge economic booming effect. It was fantastic for the economy, but guess what we did not do? We haven't cut spending. So while we stimulated the economy, and by the way, it is possible to lower taxes, yet take in more tax revenue because of its stimulating effect it has on business. But it's not a completely linear curve. Okay, there's a point at which businesses are just enjoying the extra profits, and they're not actually paying a whole lot more. Not a whole lot more revenue is actually being created. So, thought I had another one in here I wanted to show you. I do not. One of the things I wanted to point out, though, is that if we continue to grow the national debt, right now, paying the national debt, servicing that debt, takes about 14% of total tax revenue every year. So right now we can service that debt, but think about it's growing exponentially. So by the time your grandkids are in the workforce, that means there's going to be a whole lot less money available to pay for healthcare, to pay for national defense, to pay for Social Security, to pay for veterans benefits, to pay for roads and bridges, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially our current government is doing everything in their power to stay in power. and don't give a crud about the future economic health of our country. Whatever it takes to stay in power, that's what they vote for, because we voters are suckers, right? Whatever politician can give us the most stuff, we vote for him. Historically, that's what we do, right? We all like stuff. Well, not necessarily good for our economy, but anytime anybody tries to cut spending or raise taxes, it's just a big fight. So it's not an easy problem to fix. All right. Another way that the government can help keep our economy humming along is through monetary policy. So what I would do in my notes, if I were you, when I think about monetary policy, what we're talking about is either growing or shrinking the size of the money supply. That is, the amount of money that is circulating through our economy. They do that through this organization called the Federal Reserve. If you want to be cool, you call it the Fed. Anyway, their primary job is to provide banking services for member banks. So they're like the bank for banks. Member banks pay a fee to be a member. And then they borrow money from the Federal Reserve quite often. And a lot of times these are really short-term loans, like overnight even. And they pay interest on those loans. The Federal Reserve is also the bank for the United States government. So the United States government literally has a banking and savings account. They don't call it that, but has banking accounts with the Federal Reserve. That's who the U.S. Uncle Sam's Bank is. And their job is also to carry out U.S. monetary policy. So what do we mean by monetary policy? How in the world can they grow or shrink the money supply, and why would you do such a thing? Well, again, if there's a lot of money floating around in the economy, that has a stimulating effect, right? It's good for the economy, it makes it grow. However, when you have economic growth, something that comes with that is inflation. And if you think about why that would be the case, if the economy is doing really well, businesses are doing really, really well, that means they're hiring lots of people. That means that lots of people have jobs and lots of people are spending money. Businesses are doing well, then they're not only hiring people, they're spending money buying more supplies and more inventory, building more buildings, buying more vehicles. All of that stuff makes money fly around the economy a lot more, right? Well, if there's a lot of money flying around, businesses are going to do what then? If you own a business and everybody has money, what are you going to do with your prices? You're going to raise them. You're absolutely going to raise them. So when the economy is doing well, when there's lots of money floating around, one of the bad side effects is that, well, inflation tends to go up. So sometimes through monetary policy, we need to shrink the money supply a bit so that we slow down economic growth to bring inflation under control. So there's three different ways that we can do that. Oh, I just found something in my notes I gotta mention before I forget. In your book, in section 2-2B, under debt ceiling fiscal cliff, one of the things that your book mentions is that analysts agree that the federal tax reform Congress passed in 2017 will add $1.5 trillion to the deficit over 10 years and due to a decrease in corporate taxes. Analysts do not uniformly agree on that. And by the way, it's fun to point the finger at Republicans, but to be fair, during the previous administration, we quadrupled the national debt. As in, all the presidents before Barack Obama, the debt was at one level. We quadrupled that total level during Obama's administration. So you can tell that the book's author is a Democrat because they failed to mention that the previous administration quadrupled the national debt. So again, lots of blame to go around. Both parties do stupid things with our money. All right, let's get back to the Federal Reserve. 3 things that they can do. First, we need to talk about M1 and M2 to really understand it, though. So M1, think of M1 as the money you have in your checking account. That's the money you're going to spend, right? So when we talk about M1 money supply, that means that's the money that's flowing around our economy. And there's lots of M1. The economy is growing. Now, M2. Think of M2 as the money you have in your savings account, right? Or in investments. That's the money you're saving for a rainy day. That's a smart thing to do, by the way. We'll get to that. We'll talk more about that when we get to the personal finance chapter. But M1 and M2. So when the economy is sluggish, the Federal Reserve wants to increase the money supply, right? So they want to try to get people to convert their M2 to M1. In other words, spend money. Well, and the opposite is true. If inflation is getting out of hand, we want to shrink the money supply a bit to slow down economic growth so we get inflation under control. Then we want to try to have people convert their M1 money to M2 money. Stop spending money for a while. Put it in your savings account, right? We need to get inflation under control. So I want you to understand what growing or shrinking the money supply means and why you would want to do each one, okay? All right, so 3 tools that they can use. One is open market operations. By the way, if you get a test question that asks you which one of the 3 tools the Federal Reserve uses most often to grow or shrink the money supply, it is this one, open market operations. That is, the Federal Reserve will buy or sell government securities out on the open market. All right? So if there is, let's say that the money supply, if you want to increase the money supply, let's say the economy is not doing well and you want to help increase the money supply to stimulate the economy, then you would buy government securities on the open market. The Federal Reserve would, right? Because basically that takes money held by the Fed and puts it back into the economy so that there's more money floating around, right? Another thing, now the opposite would be true too. If inflation is rising too fast, then we want to shrink the money supply to slow down the economy. That will get inflation under control. So in that case, they'd want to sell government securities on the open market. This takes money out of the economy, makes less money circulating, right? So they can use open market operations. Another thing that they can do is either raise or lower the discount rate. The discount rate is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve, the Fed, uses or charges to its member banks. So remember I told you that banks borrow money from the Federal Reserve Bank? Well, they pay interest on that. So if the Federal Reserve wants to shrink the money supply a bit, right, slow down the economy because, maybe inflation is getting out of hand, they can raise the discount rate, the interest rate that they're charging their member banks. Well, guess what? Those member banks are going to pass on that increased interest rate on to you and me and to businesses. So if interest rates are higher, people don't tend to get as much loans, right? We don't take out loans if interest rates are really high or not as often, right? It's just not that good of a deal for us. It makes our payments higher. So that has the effect of slowing down the economy. But you could also do the opposite, right? Let's say that the economy is not doing well and we need to stimulate the economy. We want more money floating around. Then we could lower the discount rate, the Fed could. And then those member banks are going to lower interest rates to you and me and businesses. When interest rates are lower, more of us and businesses get loans. And what do we do when we get a loan for something? We don't take out loans just for the fun of it. We take out a loan to buy something, right? To buy a car or buy a house or what have you. So that's another one of their tools. And then lastly, this third one they don't use very often at all, but occasionally they could raise or lower the reserve requirement. The reserve requirement simply means that's a percentage of all deposits that a bank has to hold in cash in case people want money on short notice. So, for example, if a bank has, just to keep my math easy, let's say a bank has $100,000 in deposits from all of us, right? They don't keep 100,000 or all that $100,000 in the vault. No way. They loan out most of it. That's how banks make their money, right? We want banks to make money. That keeps them around. But typically the requirement, they only have to keep about 10% of all of the deposits that they're given from you and me. They loan out 90% of it. But occasionally, the Federal Reserve might raise the reserve requirement up a point or two or three or a tenth of a point. And that has the same effect, right? If banks have less money that they're allowed to loan out, well, you and me get less loans, and that slows down the economy. If they lower the reserve requirement and banks can loan out more money, then you and me do so. We get more loans and we spend that money, and that grows the economy. So those are three tools that the Fed can use. All right, so just to make sure you understand this for test purposes, I made you a couple scenario slides just so you'll get some test questions correctly on that topic. So if the economy is contracting, right, it's going downward. The forecast is negative as far as the economy. If you are the Federal Reserve, what would you do? Well, you want to increase the money supply. How do you do it? Well, you buy government securities, you reduce the discount rate, you reduce reserve requirement, right? All three of those things would stimulate or grow the economy. And then I did the opposite too. I would print out these slides before I took my test. At least this slide for sure. Let's say that prices are rising too fast. You got out of control inflation. Then what could the Fed do? Well, they want to decrease the money supply. They do this by selling government securities, increasing the discount rate, and increasing the reserve requirement. Okay? Now, primarily, probably only do one, but they might do the second one, and very rarely do they actually do the third one, just so you know. All right, let's take a quick look at some economic systems. The economic system that a country operates in has a big impact on the health of their economy. So let's look at some economic systems. Capitalism. Capitalism is based on private ownership, economic freedom, and competition, right? Analysts will tell you that no economic system is perfect. However, capitalism has brought the greatest wealth to countries more than any other system in history. Now, it also means, though, that there are winners and losers, and a lot of people do not like that. They're like, well, it's not fair that some people are smarter than others, or what have you, have different gifts, or can afford better education. On the other hand, we also know that it's very motivational for everybody, regardless of their gifts. So essentially, capitalism works by each individual acting in their own best interests, right? That doesn't mean that everybody doesn't try to help each other and give to charity and do nice things. But what it does mean is just kind of like what you're doing by taking this course, right? You are educating yourself so that you can get a better job. You are acting in your own best self-interest. When you get your first big professional job, you're going to work your tail off. You're going to try to do a better job than your coworkers because you want to get promoted. You're going to, again, act in your own self-interest. Because if you get promoted, you'll make more money, right? And we all like stuff. And by the way, you can do a lot more good charity-wise if you're making more money. So, don't get too hung up on the statement that people have to act in their own best interest. It's very motivating, the capitalist system, all right? So, of paramount importance, one of the main things I want you to remember is that the individual. Capitalism is about the individual. It creates a lot of innovation, but requires a lot of hard work, and it requires a lot of self-reliance. In other words, people have to be willing to fend for themselves, make their own fortunes, to earn their own success. Now, keep in mind, in a capitalist system or free market system, individuals, businesses, and nonprofits privately own most enterprises, most businesses, for example. Only a small portion are owned by the government. In other words, here in America, we're mostly a free market capitalist country. It's one of the reasons we're the wealthiest country on earth. But our government still owns some things, right? They own the military. I think that's probably, we could all agree is a good thing. We want our government to own the military. They also own a lot of school systems. They own various healthcare systems. There's a county hospital in every city or in every county, in every major county anyway. There's a lot of things that the government owns, schools, libraries, that kind of thing. This is a good thing. So we're not completely a free market capitalist country, but we definitely lean that way. Fundamental rights of capitalism. We take these things for granted in our country, right? We all have the right to own and operate a business and keep our profits and do with our profits whatever the heck we want. That is after we pay taxes. We have the right to own property. We have the right to free choice, to work where we want to work, sell the legal products that we want to, and charge whatever we want to. We also have the right to fair competition. We take that for granted sometimes. We have laws in place to protect businesses from unfair competition for the most part. Now, along with capitalism, we talk about competition. First of all, please play the competition video that is in Chapter 2 in the online digital resources, if you have access to that. It will explain very, very succinctly the difference between the three major types of competition. All right? In fact, there's actually one more that you'll see on the next slide. So in pure competition, we're talking about people selling virtually identical products, like, say, apples, right? For the most part, a healthy, fresh apple is a healthy, fresh apple, right? If it's the same kind of apple. Less and less of this there's not that much pure competition. But it is definitely exists. Monopolistic competition is definitely what you're going to see most often, right? It's a lot of competitors selling differentiated products at different price points. Restaurants is a great example, right? We've got all kinds of fast food restaurants that sell cheap food. And then we got kind of that mid-level sit-down restaurant where you're going to pay a little bit more, but the food's hopefully a little bit better, a little nicer environment. And then you got some high-end restaurants where you got really expensive food and a really fancy environment, right? That's monopolistic competition. Then you have oligopolies, right? That's when you have just a handful of competitors selling similar or different products, but there's not that many of them because the price of getting into that kind of business is really prohibitive. It's very expensive. For example, if you wanted to get into the car manufacturing business, that's super expensive, right? Or if you wanted to start a television station or an oil company, there's not that many of them because it's really expensive to get into it. Okay? There's one more kind of competition that is monopoly. That's when you have a single producer dominating an industry. Now, typically that is a bad thing, but not always. For example, the book gives an example of you wouldn't want a whole bunch of different water companies piping with a bunch of different pipes leading into your house, right? That wouldn't make sense. So in that case, the government, like a city government, will allow one water company to put pipes, to own the pipes, the water systems, and then they regulate that company because they don't have competition to do it for us. But patented products and copyrighted products, you could also think of those as monopolies. Okay, somebody writes a book. You and me can't just go copy that book and resell it. That would be an infringement, right? So that is a type of monopolistic competition that is actually a good thing. All right, so supply, I wanted to show you just a really quick, the book does a pretty good job, I think, of explaining the concept of supply and demand. So I want to make sure that you understand the dynamic interaction between buyers and sellers and how this affects a range of products and prices within a free market. So we're still in capitalism right now, all right? So it's important to remember that supply and demand don't operate in a vacuum. The constant interaction between the two forces helps determine the market price in any given category. In theory, market prices adjust toward the point where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect. Okay? So think of supply as the quantity of products that a producer, as in a company, is willing to offer for sale at different market prices, right? So since businesses always seek to make as much profit as possible, they're likely going to produce more of a product that commands a higher price and less of a product that commands a lower price, or at least a higher or lower profit margin anyway, right? The relationship now between price and quantity from a supplier standpoint is what's shown in the graph called the supply curve, right? The supply curve maps the quantity on the x-axis. That's the axis that goes horizontally, left to right, right? And the price, which is on the y-axis, or the vertical up and down axis. In most categories, as the price goes up, the quantity produced goes up, yielding a graph that curves up as it moves to the right. All right? Now, demand refers to the quantity of products that consumers are willing to buy at different market prices. So since consumers generally seek to get products they need or want at the lowest possible prices, they tend to buy more of products with lower prices and fewer products with higher prices. That makes sense, right? So the relationship between price and quantity from a demand standpoint is shown on the graph called the demand curve. So like the supply curve, the demand curve maps quantify, or the quantity thereof, is on the x-axis and price is on the y-axis. But different from the supply curve, the demand curve for most goods and services will slope downward as it moves to the right. Okay? So in theory, market prices are going to adjust to the point where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect. The price associated with this point of intersection, by the way, the point where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied, is called the equilibrium price. And the quantity, of course, associated with this point is called the equilibrium quantity. Okay? So just kind of dumbing this down, the book gives a really good example using pizza as an example. So if, let's say that a company sells, just like the book says, sells tacos and it sells pizza. The profit margin on tacos is really low. So that restaurant probably isn't going to make as many tacos. If the profit margin is, or price is much higher on pizzas, it's going to make more pizzas. So the higher, maybe they have several different kinds of pizza. They're going to make more, as much as they can, of the most expensive ones, right? But you, as a consumer, may go, you know what? I'm going to buy more tacos because they're cheaper. I'm going to buy pizza some too, but not near as often, right? So you'd be on the demand curve, right? You as a consumer. Well, if you were to overlay those two ideas, let's take pizza, right? The business owner is going to say, you know what? We are going to make pizza and sell it at such and such amount, such and such price, all the way until we think that consumers are going to buy the most of it, right? It's because at some point, you and I are not going to buy pizzas anymore if the price is too high. So business owners are going to set prices as they see fit based on how they think they can make the most profit. Okay, so that's really what the supply and demand curve is all about. Again, be sure and watch the video that is on competition, the law of supply and demand, that is in this video that I put on this slide. And by the way, if you notice the top of the slide, it says Investopedia. I got that from the Investopedia website. All kinds of great stuff in there. So they will help you understand the supply and demand curve process by watching that video. Okay, so check that out. You can download these slides. If you don't have the digital book, you can just download these slides and then you'll be able to play that video. All right. Now, there's another kind of economy, and those are more socialist and communist economies. All right, so in a socialist economy, the government owns and operates key enterprises. Like, say, and by the way, a lot of countries that we consider socialist, they do not think that they are socialist. For example, we think England is a socialist country because the government owns so many key enterprises. Like in England, the government owns all the oil companies and all the energy companies, utility companies. The government owns all that. The government owns healthcare. The government even owns media there. It owns the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company. That's owned by the government. But again, it varies. I think it's a matter of degrees, right? In America, the government owns some key enterprises here also, but in European countries, the government owns more. You could say that they are more socialistic. Okay, and then communism. Now, in a pure communist economy, the government owns all enterprises, and they manage them in the interest of the collective, everybody as a whole. Now, as you might imagine, if you watch the news at all, you will know that the very socialist countries are in debt way worse than we are, to the point where they are pulling back from socialism and going more in the direction of free market. But here in the United States, which direction are we going? We are going towards the failed socialist system. Couldn't tell you why. Now, communist countries, there's not many left because it just flat doesn't work at all, right? Some of the poorest countries on earth are communist. North Korea, there's millions of people starving there. Cuba, if you've ever been to Cuba, super crazy poor country. Venezuela used to be one of the richest, most oil-rich countries on earth. They went socialist, and then now are really taking the plunge towards outright communism. Good luck with that. But here's the direction of most countries, right? A mixed economy. To one degree of free market versus socialism, to different degrees, right? So they're using a little bit of both, right? They're trying to meet the needs of citizens by owning some things. Like here in America, the government owns post office, public schools, hospitals, libraries, the military. It owns a lot of stuff. And they do that in the interest of citizens. Some government-owned businesses, actually, in some cases, the government, and this is happening a lot in Europe, they're actually privatizing a lot of entities that used to be owned by the government because the government simply does not run things efficiently or effectively. The reason is there's no incentive for them to do so. The people who work for the government have no incentive to save money, because if they save money, then they get less budget the next year. And so it's just like this constant state of degradation, right? So it becomes more and more expensive to you and me as taxpayers. So a lot of cases, the government is starting to privatize things that used to be owned by the government. Prisons, in a lot of cases, are gone private sector. The government's like, you know what, this is too expensive for us to run. Let's let a private corporation run this prison. Now, can there be problems when you do that? Absolutely. Again, it's a balancing act. I can't tell you which is the best way to go. It depends on the situation. All right. Now, getting towards the end here, let's start to wrap up. How do you know if an economy is doing well or not? Well, there's some key economic indicators that can kind of help you understand that. One of them is gross domestic product, and it's simply the total value of all goods and services produced within the physical boundaries of a given country over a given period of time, right? And usually it's by month or by year. This is a really basic measure of economic health, the gross domestic product, right? So it's also a great way to compare growth between nations. Another one is the unemployment rate. Obviously, not everyone wants to work, but what we're looking at when you talk about the employment rate or the unemployment rate is the people over 16 who are actively seeking work. Okay? Now, there's different kinds of employment that you need to be aware of. Frictional unemployment is when people quit a job by choice, right? Typically, they're usually quitting by choice. Now, in some cases, strictly speaking, it could be people that are fired, but the economy is great. And so in either case, people can get another job, no sweat. That's called frictional unemployment. Structural unemployment, though, is when people simply don't have the skills for the jobs that are available, right? So like, for example, in the IT sector right now, there are tons of companies that just cannot find people with the technical skills to do the jobs that they need to have done. And so that is structural unemployment. And then there's such a thing called cyclical unemployment. So that's when the economy takes a downturn, companies, their sales go down, therefore they have to lay people off in order to stay afloat. That's cyclical unemployment. By the way, before I forget, full employment is typically considered around 4%. When the unemployment rate gets down to about 4%, which is where it is now, that is considered full employment, because that kind of takes into account frictional unemployment, cyclical unemployment, and seasonal unemployment. Okay, so seasonal unemployment, the best example is like a department store Santa Claus, right? They only have a job during December or late November to through December, right? So the rest of the year, they are seasonably unemployed. Better example might be, though, say landscaping. A lot of landscaping workers are laid off, and then in the wintertime, that would be seasonally unemployed. Okay? All right. Let's also take a look at some of the business cycles. Now, one of the things that need you to understand is that the economy ebbs and flows. It goes up and down, and it has to. It absolutely has to. And I'll tell you why. Because as the economy grows, unemployment gets really, really low. Look, because the economy is growing, business is doing well, they're hiring people, so unemployment gets really low, and that's a very good thing. But at some point, prices start to get out of control. And so we have to shrink the money supply a bit to slow down the economy. When you do that, the economy comes back down. Well, a lot of times these rises, these contractions and expansions, they're going to happen on their own naturally anyway. When the government steps in with its fiscal policy and monetary policy, they are trying to impact these natural contractions and expansions within the economic cycle. Okay? So just a couple of, so make sure you understand, contraction is when the economy is slowing down or headed downward. If you have 2 consecutive quarters of this downward trend, it's called a recession. If it goes on for 4 quarters or more, it's called a depression. Recovery is when things start to get better. And then if that continues, then we call it an expansion. Right now, we are definitely in an expansion. We've been in expansion since about, arguably since about 2012. It's greatly accelerated since about 2014. So that's kind of where our economy is at now. Inflation is another good economic indicator. Now, inflation is when average prices are rising. Now, I don't want you to think that inflation is necessarily a bad thing, because really it is not. In fact, what we really want is for inflation to rise slowly and predictably. That is a good thing. That is healthy for our economy. However, if it rises way too fast, and that's called hyperinflation. We absolutely do not want that. You're headed for the economy to collapse if that takes place. We also do not want disinflation. If prices actually start going, if the economy slows down to the point where prices actually, on average, start going down, that is definitely, that is deflation. And that is a very, very bad thing. Now, if you've got hyperinflation, it starts to slow down, that's called disinflation. And that can be a very healthy thing. All right. Consumer Price Index is another one. Essentially, it's a weighted average of goods and services that most of us buy each month. This is literally when I say a market basket, it's like sometimes they'll have things there like that most of us buy every month, like milk, bread, eggs, hamburger meat, a variety of things. It could also include things like car insurance and electricity, utility bills, things like that. So it's a weighted average of goods and services. The producer price index is kind of the same thing, but from a business perspective, right? That's from the perspective of businesses. So you're taking a weighted average of wholesale prices. That's the things that businesses have to buy each month, all right? Another thing to keep in mind as far as economic performance is taking a look at productivity. How efficiently and effectively businesses are able to produce their products and services, right? For example, if in a given country, through use of technology, for example, here in America, let's say that you can very efficiently build a lot of high quality widgets in a given factory, right? A widget is like an imaginary product, right? If you can make more widgets for the same amount of money, you're being more productive. You're being more efficient. Now, in other countries where they don't have as much technology, they might not, let's say that they make widgets too, but for the same price that we can make 1 million widgets, they can only make 500,000 widgets. So they are less efficient. They're less productive, okay? So you can kind of see how measures of productivity can tell you a lot about the growth of a nation, all right? That's essentially what we have for this chapter. Please make sure that you have a good understanding of all of these concepts. I would look at flashcards for each one of these before I took the test. Some of the key things that we talked about in this chapter are here. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. That's chapter 2.